Good morning. The thing about electronics is I'm not going to introduce you because your lovely picture is on the screen. So let's start straight away. If I can ask the director of Hong Kong Observatory, which is the government's climate science authority in Hong Kong, CM, give us a kind of sense of the global picture of climate change.
Yeah. Thank you, Christine, and good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. Spend a few minutes on the science. Currently, 2018, we're probably on track to become the 4th hottest year on record. But which are the top 3 hottest years on record? It's the past 3 years. So in other words, we are always at the top right now. That is a good sign of global warming. And as you know, we already 1 degree above the pre-industrial level in terms of the global temperatures. And so if our aim is to keep our global temperatures to within 1.5 degrees, we have a little time to go. And that's I understand Ruby will talk more about the 1.5 degrees issues in a moment. But on current track, we probably will reach the 1.5 degrees between 2030 to 2052. So really time is very short for us to take actions. For the carbon dioxide level, which is of course the major culprit for the greenhouse gas and global warming, now we are standing at 407 parts per million. And if we look back to our past, when the Earth has this level before, it was 3 million years ago. And at that time, the temperature was 1.8 to 3.6 degrees higher than pre-industrial level. So that's probably the level that we will get if we don't do anything. But more alarming, the sea level 3 million years ago was 10 to 30 meters above today. So we have always been saying that IPCC's estimate of around 1 meter increase in the sea level by the end of this century is rather conservative. We have lots of uncertainties, of course, in the melting of the glaciers, in the melting of the Antarctica ice sheets. But the uncertainties doesn't mean that we can sit here and do nothing. Every time the IPCC assessment get an update, we see the figures are elevated every time. So that's why in Hong Kong we basically utilize the higher margin of the assessment to guide the adaptation and mitigation actions. So I think I don't need to elaborate more on the extreme weather events that you have already seen around the world or even experienced yourself. Mangood is indeed, as Secretary Wong said, is a wake-up call. Actually, Observatory will be issuing a blog on, actually with this subject headline, a wake-up call for Hong Kong people. We have not get such a severe typhoon in the past 30 years. But this typhoon, even though it broke many records, it is not a full-fledged super typhoon landing on Hong Kong. So the very important question for Hong Kong, being in a coastal environment, are we prepared for the next big one, a full-fledged super typhoon landing over Hong Kong? So I think that's one important question I think we need to address, hopefully starting the dialogue today. Thank you, Christine.
Well, CM, that deserved a clap, because I think this is an acknowledgement by the science authority at the Hong Kong government that we really need to treat this extremely seriously, and also your estimations is really at the higher level. So that's a very practical approach. CM, perhaps I can come back to you a little later to talk more specifically about Hong Kong. I'd like to now invite Ruby to give us a sense of perhaps the IPCC report, you know, the 1.5 special report. What are the things that you really want us to focus on?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about climate change. So as Director SHUN talked about, global warming has very important effects on extreme weathers like tropical cyclones and things like that. And it's both global and local, right? So we know that climate models projecting into the future, by the end of this century, the warming will be anywhere between 1.5 degree to 4.5 degree. And so this recent report, IPCC report, talking about a warming of 1.5 degree is really at the very low end of what is possible between 1.5 and 4.5. We know that climate change impacts generally increase with the degree of warming. So you would expect that 1.5 degree, the impacts would be lower than, for example, 4.5 degree or 3 degrees. But still, this report really highlights the fact that even with 1.5 degree warming, there are very significant impacts that we need to think about. So these impacts include, for example, increase in hot extremes, increase in heavy precipitation, increase in the probability of drought and precipitation deficit, and also increase in the intensity of tropical cyclones as well as sea level rise. And the report also talks about impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, and also the risk to human health, water supply, food security, and also economic development. So these impacts, I think, shouldn't be surprising to us because so far, we have already experienced 1 degree warming since pre-industrial time, and there are multiple observational evidences of the impacts of climate change. So, but this report, I think another very important point that we want to note is that ultimately the impacts of 1.5 degree warming depends on the trajectory of the warming itself. For example, if you would imagine increasing the temperature, global mean temperature gradually by 1.5 degree and then stabilizing, the impacts of this trajectory would be very different from, for example, another trajectory where you might allow the warming to overshoot to above 1.5 degree and then bring it back down to 1.5 degree before the end of the century. And partly the reason is because some impacts are irreversible and some impacts could really take a long time to recover. So it means that it's very important for us to consider what we need to do in terms of keeping our warming to this level and reduce the impacts to our society.
Well, KS, perhaps you can also remind us a little bit about the timetable, because Hong Kong is following the Paris Agreement timetable as a part of China, and the IPCC will come up with more reports. But I think it's important for any community, including ours in Hong Kong, to have a sense of the pace at which the government has to be working to fit in with the Paris timetable. So perhaps you can remind us of that.
Okay, thank you, Christine. I said in the opening that as the minister that we set out the policies, the structure within the government, and also launch initiatives to engage the public, including the universities and other stakeholders. There are 3 key aspects: mitigation, i.e. decarbonization, adaptation, and resilience. Firstly, I said earlier that we are going to launch the public engagement to talk about the longer-term decarbonization for Hong Kong. That would be timely because it would be after the forthcoming COP meeting and also after all these reports. So the engagement would be in the first quarter next year. That would help Hong Kong to consider how we can deepen the decarbonization strategies, targets, and also a longer-term target up to 2050. So I encourage all of you to give the relevant input during the forthcoming public engagement. And the timing is that we'd like to collect the input within, say, 2019, and then with the government we can review the opinions, ideas, and then we can finalize our longer-term target by 2020. That's number one. Second is about the adaptations. Within the government, we set up a working group, currently led by the Development Bureau's CDD, the Civil Engineering and Development Departments, together with the relevant works departments, to consider how we should, based on the updated science and also the climate information, about the strengthening of the infrastructure and related major facilities, climate adaptation to extreme weathers. And after the recent super typhoon, I think we are getting more information and evidence. So the relevant working group, based on the information, would further consider how the major infrastructures, etc., should be further strengthened with respect to the climate adaptation. Lastly, is that after the super typhoon, I think we did pretty reasonably well, right, in the forecast, given our Hong Kong Director is here, and also the preparation during the super typhoon. But there are comments about how we should handle after the event. Anyway, that we have been setting up a group led by the Security Bureau this time, and together attended by about, say, 30 departments within the government to review how we can do better in future in relation to this kind of extreme weather, from the preparation, forecast, etc., and also during the event, and then after the event, the post-event. So I think this kind of structures would help Hong Kong to strengthen the mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Thank you.
So, KS, maybe I can just ask you to clarify so that we can all fall in to follow the timetable. So what you're saying is the public consultation will take place in 2019 and or started already?
We have the kind of bottom-up approach. So they have a focus group, small group engagement have been doing, okay, and they are working on the document, probably will be finalized within this year. And the formal territorial-wide engagement will start in the first quarter next year.
Right, so what we want is all of you to be responding in 2019 to that exercise. And the government will have to prepare a report in 2020, is that right?
Yes. It's kind of bottom-up approach instead of top-down approach. So we invited the SDC, the Council for Sustainable Development, to carry out this bottom-up approach. So it's really based on science, on the stakeholders, etc. So after the public engagement, probably would say through 2019, they would make the recommendation to me. I represent the government to receive the report. So we consider the recommendations, including target strategies, solutions, etc. Then we would provide the response within 2020.
Okay, great. So for the next couple of years, we all have a lot to do to support the government in this process. Maybe I can ask Professor Chie whether you can give us a sense of how the country as a whole, how China is dealing with the major part of climate policies.
Well, China committed on the Paris Agreement to peak the carbon emissions by around 2030, and trying to do its best, make a best effort to peak earlier. Another major commitment under the Paris Agreement was to increase the proportion of non-fossil fuel energy to 20%, to around 20%. So the Chinese government policy on climate change is really focused on mitigation and focused on the energy sector. So there are a couple of things. First is to increase the energy efficiency. It's a matter, the energy efficiency can be measured, the economic energy efficiency can be measured as the energy intensity, energy use per unit of GDP. So that has been going quite well, ever since the 1980. So in the last 40 years or so, the energy intensity has been decreasing by 5% a year, and recent years that has been accelerated. Secondly is on the energy mix. China made a commitment at Copenhagen at the year 2009 to increase the proportion of non-fossil fuel energy to 15% by the end of last year, 2017. It's already 13.8%. We will expect in the next 3 years, in the 3 years, 18, 19, and 20, and that target should be met. Now, also under Copenhagen, again, 2009, the carbon intensity to drop by 40 to 45%. Again, by the end of last year, 2017, the Chinese carbon intensity has dropped by 46%, already exceeded the target for that one. More profoundly, in our recent research article just published, we actually see the year 2014. That is a very, very special year. The November 12th, 2014 was a day when the United States and China made the joint announcement on climate change to peak carbon emissions, Chinese carbon emissions by 2030. And that year appeared to be already the peaked. But we don't really use that word because that peak is rather the entry point for a plateau. So that plateau can go as long as 1 decade. So by the year 2025, we begin to see a decline of the absolute carbon emissions. So therefore, I think China has done very well to meet the target for Copenhagen. And I also see it's doing very well on meeting the target for the Paris Agreement. Now, the 20% of non-fossil fuel, look, we don't really use the word clean energy or renewable energy. We use non-fossil fuel. That means we can have a lot of nuclear and large hydro built in over there. So that has been going pretty well. Then I will see by the year 2030, it is quite possible to have a 25% of that. So this is all consistent with the plan released in 2016. This is 1 year after the Paris Agreement. China made a mid to long-term strategy for energy development. Within that, one particular element is to put a cap on the total energy consumption, particularly on total coal consumption, because China, as we know, consumes more than half of all coal consumption worldwide. And the good news is, by 2013, and that the coal consumption has already peaked. We know there will be ups and downs, but that's pretty much the trend. Another very important policy was implemented last year to set up a nationwide market for carbon emissions. So that I know a lot of people are not very satisfied because initially 3 years ago when this was first announced, we're trying to develop a carbon market to cover 8 different industrial sectors. Last year, China built a nationwide carbon market for 1 sector, the power sector, but still that covers 1,700 enterprises. It covered more than 30% of all emissions nationwide. So that's pretty good. This is going on. Then China also emphasizes on science, and very big participant for IPCC and also IPCC 1.5 report and the 6th IPCC assessment report and overall. But I see one problem is that China has not done very well. It's really making an effort. Is exactly the subject we're talking about here today. It's on adaptation and resilience. As we know, most of the Chinese cities are built along the coastal lines, very, very vulnerable to climate change of this kind. And this is a very, very important subject for China. I look forward to the further discussion, with our speakers and the audience here. So look forward to learning from all of you.
Right, we certainly hope that the work that we do in Hong Kong can dovetail with the work that is going to be done or being done in Guangdong province, because we have to look regionally. Perhaps I can come to Carlos. We're very fortunate to have you here because we seldom hear too much about South America. So perhaps you can give us a kind of a quick summary of the situation in South America, and perhaps a few words about where you come from Brazil. What are you doing in terms of climate change?
Okay. Thank you, Christine. First of all, good morning, everyone. And I would like to thank the organizing committee for the invitation, Professor Liu. It's an honor to be here and talk about climate change. About the situation in South America, I would say I don't have good news. Most of our bad news. So the situation, fortunately, it's not that good. Because first of all, when we think about climate change, we have already experienced a lot of changes. When you look at the data, for instance, floods, it has increased in the last 20 years across South America. And droughts, the same thing. For instance, in Northeast Brazil, we are experiencing probably the strongest drought in the last 100 years. Yes, also extreme rainfalls. And this has a huge impact in all sectors. The energy sector, agriculture, urban water supply. Last year, for instance, in my city, Brasilia, it's the capital, we have a huge problem with water supply. The reservoir levels were completely down. It's a big problem. Also, human health, because especially in most cities, when we have floods, we have the spread of several diseases. Also fires in the Amazon. When we have done some study, was published this year, you see that the number of fires increases a lot when you have high temperatures. So this is the first point. The second one is about vulnerability. Probably I would say that Central America and South America are the most vulnerable countries in the world, I would say, most probably. You can see when there is an hurricane, usually in the Atlantic we call the hurricane, here is typhoon, when a hurricane hits some Central America country like Cuba, Guatemala, El Salvador, it has a huge impact. So this is another point. And finally, our adaptation capacity is very, very, very low, because it's hard for us to build like resilient cities. First, because it requires money, and the situation is not nowadays in most South American and Central America countries. The economic situation is not that good. And second, it also requires political will. That's also difficult to achieve. So the situation now, I would say that's not that good, unfortunately. And climate change, something it's present. When we shouldn't just think about future climate change. We are already experiencing climate change, so it's something present that we have to act now. That's my point.
Well, I think we're very fortunate, perhaps in this part of the world, where we already have quite good adaptation arrangements, but it's important to be reminded that there are many other parts of the world where things are much worse. But perhaps that will encourage us to work harder in this whole topic. If I can come to Stephanie, adaptation, well, mitigation and adaptation. But in terms of talking about adaptation, how to strengthen our infrastructure, it all costs a lot of money. So where is the money going to come from, and how should we look at that?
Yes, that's a good question. It's a question a group of us have been looking at for a while, and I acknowledge colleagues from co-researchers from Newcastle University, Leeds, Birmingham, and an international advisory group too, in being able to form the words for what I'm going to say now. So I think I'm going to talk now about physical adaptation of infrastructure to improve its physical resilience, but I think the principles could be applied to other forms of adaptation for resilience. And in order to answer the who pays, I think we need to very explicitly determine the maximum value that can be derived from an adaptation measure. And to remember that the value is not static with time, nor is it isolated to the physical location in which the adaptation measure is produced. And when we do look at these wider values and look at changes with space and time, it may enable us to find different funding and financing mechanisms for those adaptation measures. And I'll illustrate that with a very small example from Newcastle, where I come from in the UK. So in the centre of Newcastle, there is a development site, a 10-hectare development site. It's adjacent to Newcastle United football ground, for any of you who know that. And on that site, we're developing various different buildings, but debating what size of pipes we're going to put in beneath the ground to deal with the stormwater. And actually, Newcastle was hit by 2 1 in 200 year rainfall events in 2012. So we're a little bit conscious of the need for large pipes. But who pays for that currently is the developer. So the developer of the site bears all the cost of those adaptation measures, if you like, resilience measures on the site. And yet it's the residents on that site who bear the risk. So what do we get? Insufficiently large pipes. However, we're thinking there far too narrowly, because we're thinking that the only people who are going to benefit is the immediate residents on the site. Yet there will be future residents. And if we start looking wider than the site itself, actually, the flash flood water from that site runs down over the main road that goes out of Newcastle. So it impacts on the road, and in 2012, that road was stopped. Nobody could get out of Newcastle going south. The rainwater flowed further than that. It flooded businesses away from the site, and it flooded the central rail station. So that central rail station takes trains from London to Scotland. They were all stopped. It also flooded the metro station. The metro station goes from the centre of Newcastle to the airport. So then nobody could get to the airport. So you've got the situation then that a tiny site with a few pipes has suddenly become an international issue. And so who should pay? So there are many, the value of that resilience measure actually plays out across that actual, ultimately international stage. And all of those people in that value network should be party to funding that resilience measure, but also it gives opportunities. All those different parties have access to different forms of funding and finance that could enable that measure to be made much more straightforwardly, if we could do it, than just looking at the one developer. Furthermore, to maximise the value of the measure, we should revisit the actual solution. So we were looking at only the solution of larger pipes, but actually we could have added the extra resilience by putting in green infrastructure. So keep your pipes the same and put some green infrastructure to store the stormwater and to release it more slowly into the environment. That green infrastructure then increases the value of that measure by adding in environmental benefits, social benefits, cleaning air, and cleaning the water that ultimately ends up in the river. So all of those considerations might enable us to put in greater resilience, but it would need this interdisciplinary policy making that we were talking about at the start of the conference, and I don't have any answers as to how we do that.
Right. Well, that's great, because I think it illustrates for all of us the kind of broad thinking that really is necessary for us, particularly I think in Hong Kong and in southern China, where there is a lot of development and building that is still going on. And I remember a time with the secretary, we were talking about drainage services as we extend development into Hong Kong. So perhaps there are a number of engineering and infrastructure issues we need to think in a much broader and more holistic way as we go forward. Now, we still have a little time, and I think the audience probably would like to ask a question or two, but let me come back to the region here. For CM, for CHIE, for KS, or any of the panelists, in terms of the tropics, in terms of southern China here, what do you think are really some of the major things that are going to hit us?
Certainly, as we are now talking about reclamation of land, so sea level rise would be one of the most important issues that we together need to address. Definitely, as I just mentioned, we have to plan for the worst super typhoons hitting Hong Kong. With sea level rise, which still depends on these different emission scenarios, but we expect that by the middle of this century, it will be close to 0.5 meter, and by the end of the century, close to 1 meter. Of course, we have some differences between the different assessments, but that's what I believe to be most probable. So, even if we discount the typhoons, right now our high tides are already 2.5 meters above our chart datum. 1 meter of increase of sea level will mean that it's already 3.5 meters by the end of the century for those high tides. So sooner or later, our low-lying areas will have this kind of nuisance floods. So this is already something that we need to do. But of course, for the typhoons, for the severe typhoons or super typhoons, for Mangkhut, if it didn't weaken because of interaction with Luzon, our model assessment at the time was really shocking to me. I was really concerned. That's why we issued advance warning
so you were much more worried
early.
at
That's
one
right.
stage, is that okay?
Exactly. Some of our worst figures was for the Victoria Harbour to see 5 meters of storm surge, which is more than 1 meter higher than what we get finally. And for Tolo Harbour, Sha Tin, Tai Po, which has been seriously damaged in the past, historical typhoons, we obtained the number of 7 meters. And this is not yet taking into account climate change, sea level rise. So I think I will leave it here. Of course, for the other aspect, we need to be concerned as well, like heavy rain. I know that our engineering departments are concerned about the stability of the natural slopes. We have done a great job in reinforcing our artificial slopes, but for the natural slope, look at what happened in 2008, the black rainstorm. If that same rainstorm happened in the urban areas, we will be in trouble. And we expect heavy and heavier rain in the future. And finally, heat stress for the city. Of course, many of us enjoy the air conditioning all the time. Not KS or myself, but we should not forget we have vulnerable groups, people like to do sports and laborers working outdoor, and also the underprivileged without enjoying the air conditioning. We expect more and more very hot days and hot nights, and those I think we also need to address.
So, I mean, in other words, you believe that we will see in all those areas much greater extremes.
That's
so
right.
Downpours, storm surges, heat.
Yep.
How about cold?
I won't say that it won't happen by the end of the century, because as extreme events become more, we will see many more very hot days or hot nights, but still there's some odds of very cold temperatures for a very short period of time.
Right. I mean, you will remember, a very freezing winter, and we're less prepared for, even though, it was just a few days. So I think in temperature, again, it's something in terms of resilience that we need to think about as well. Chia, you said earlier on that China as a whole really needs to do more on adaptation and resilience. What do you think we can do together between Hong Kong and southern China, the tropical areas? What would you like to see?
Well, Christine, you mentioned in your opening remarks about IPCC 1.5. This report actually trying to give us an optimistic tone there by saying that it is still possible to limit the temperature rise within 1.5 degrees if we can do the right thing. But listening to Director Shen on this and understanding all the figures, it is actually quite unlikely that we can get 1.5. If there's anything sure is we're going to have more climate extremes, including what you just mentioned, cold in the tropical areas. So I think really what the society in general, international communities, is to focus on adaptation and resilience. I think that right now, this Greater Bay area development really should be the focus for what you just mentioned if we want to develop a better collaboration between mainland China, Hong Kong, in this general area. This should be the focus because the plan is laid out, it's being laid out right now. The president was here, did then to emphasize the way as I see it, this is perhaps the next largest program in the entire region, here in Asia, maybe also in globally. And as a matter of fact, I think this is probably a largest program ever you see in the human history. I'm not exaggerated it. I think really, in the planning phase and also in implementation phase, we should build in this very idea of adaptation and resilience into the entire plan for infrastructure, auto construction, even our daily life activities. So I think we really need to focus on building a climate resilient, sustainable Greater Bay Area. This is a challenge. This is also opportunity for all of us here talking about this very subject.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes of your comments or questions. Okay, we have a gentleman there, a gentleman in front here, please.
Testing.
Yes.
Professor Kichi? Jie. Pardon my pronunciation or mispronunciation. Give us your view of the success of the Sponge City program in mainland China.
The Sponge City program is it's a great idea, first of all, because this is in a way to respond to climate change. But in another meaning of that is really to correct many of the problems in city development, urban planning, and real estate development. There are a number of pilot programs, one city in each province, so totally 31 of them. A lot of money put in that, and a very large engineering project with a lot of public money, and at the same time, using this idea of a private-public partnership. So I should say it's a very important project, the honorable goals, but the implementation of that should have incorporated this climate change idea into that. So far as I see, my limited view of that is this is primarily focused on the engineering side of that and the financing side. Now, as many of us know, the PPP itself is facing a lot of challenges in terms of financing. So I am not worried about the pilot programs, but I do worry about the sustainability of other cities because the project so far is extremely capital intensive and it requires a lot of financing and a lot of engineering. I think it can be done better.
Yes, second question.
Miriam Pierce, first off to CM SHUN, thank you very much for sharing numbers. We're in a room of people that are probably interested in this topic. When you're talking about the website, your predictions that have scared you, how are they shared with the community? Because I think as we start building and have these different infrastructure projects coming, just making sure how real we do need to lift up and change our model of development in Hong Kong. And if there's a second part to that question, it is how are we communicating this in other parts of the world, and where are we seeing any examples of getting that community to really buy in to changing the base building approach and information sharing about this climate change?
Can I make this a bit more simple? How high are we going to build anything, right?
But how do we show people that we have the numbers to how high we need
right,
to be?
That's right, the science. And then perhaps Carlos and Stephanie, you can talk a little bit about the second part of the questions. How do you get everybody to kind of work together? Ruby or CM?
Let me first start to respond to the question about the numbers. If you Google HKO, my organization, and climate change, then you will come to the web page with on this topic. And we have already provided all the projection figures for sea level rise, for temperature increase, for the rainfall assessment, and chance of droughts. All those projections based on the assessment report number 5 of IPCC are already publicly available. So you can use the data. But of course, for the specialized organizations and institutions like the power companies, public utilities, then we are happy to provide more elaborations, even the model results for you to make your own decisions.
So maybe Ruby, can you also give a sense, for example, in the United States, how are people looking at the data for sea level rise?
Yes, so I think giving this kind of information, bringing it down to the local level is indeed very important. So in the US, there are many regional climate centers where they bring this kind of information down to the regional level. And so there are information about sea level rise as well as storm surges and changes in precipitation and all these different types of information. I think what is very important that we are now beginning to do more of is to provide not only a single number, but also the uncertainty, right? Because we know that there are uncertainties in projecting changes in the future, so that type of information is important. Yeah.
Stephanie, how did you put everybody together to discuss what you need to do?
Okay, we had one example where we found that actually the numbers don't necessarily engage all the people that need to be engaged, and having one organisation even seeing those numbers in isolation again doesn't necessarily get you where you want to be. We ran a small exercise looking at in Newcastle where we were looking at developing an adaptation strategy for the city, and we were bringing together the emergency services with the local housing provider, with the local authority, with the people who run the roads, all in the same room at the same time so that they have a conversation with each other, and then converting the numbers into a future scenario. So actually playing it out as a storm on a map to actually say, and these roads are blocked and these things are going to be blown down. And that evacuation policy that you had for your schools, well, you can't do that because the road's going to be blocked. And look at where you've got the hospital, actually the roads are going to be blocked from there as well. So it was turning the numbers into something that was meaningful, and also having the different players in the room at the same time so that they could look how their decisions were playing out with each other, not just on themselves.
Was it the government or the local authority or some other organisation that were bringing all these people together?
The local authority were charged with creating the plan, but of course it isn't just the local authority. It requires all these agencies, the health agency, the housing provider, etc., all to be part of that plan.
Right. So we need convening power, we need to be able to identify the right stakeholders, and we need to know how to moderate those very complex decisions. Carlos, maybe I can just ask you, you painted a very difficult and challenging picture in your part of the world. But how do South Americans or Brazilians, despite all the problems, how do you come together to discuss these things?
That's that's a tough question because the thing is, it's as I told you, is climate change is really, really, really important. And nowadays, especially in my country, we have so many priorities, like economy and social issues, that sometimes climate change goes down. And I was going to say also about for instance, the Paris Agreement, that most likely we won't meet our commitments. They are like very, very, very ambitious. Like we expect to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 37% by 2025 and 43% by 2030. But these numbers are hard to achieve, especially because deforestation, it responds to about 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at the data, that's good news. We have some monitoring system from satellite data that we can see how big is the deforestation every year, every month. And when you look at since 2012, it has increased. That's really, really bad. But when you look at the situation, It's like our environmental protect agency. It has about, just to give you some feeling about the numbers, you have one inspector for over 200,000 hectares of area in the Amazon. This is about one guy for Hong Kong to inspect the entire area. And this is almost impossible, and their job is very dangerous. I just saw in the news like 4 days ago, some inspectors, they were attacked by, not farmers, I think these people are like criminals. And so this is the situation, and if we don't meet these requirements, basically it will affect all over the world. I mean, the impacts are not only in Brazil. And now, the other point is, I'm not sure if you are aware, but tomorrow is the presidential election in my country, and most likely the next president has no, the guy who most probably will be elected has no commitments with the environment. I mean, at least that's my impression, because he doesn't say anything. So, no commitments with climate change. And so we're gonna need to get together and have some, I think, international support, because otherwise, especially for mitigation, it's not going to happen. It will affect all the other countries. So if we don't see it, then we have some international conversation, international support.
Well, Carlos, thank you for the reminder, because what he's really saying is deforestation very far away from us is going to have a direct impact on all of us. So since politics is important, you know, political determination, commitments are really important. I'm going to give the final word to Secretary Wong. We are fortunate to have you, because I know from personal experience that you really want to do a lot more in climate change. So this is the opportunity today for you to keep rallying us and keeping us stimulated and excited. Please.
Okay, thank you. I think I've been sharing with you about what the Hong Kong government is trying to do within the territory. And we need your support, say, on the forthcoming public engagement on further deeper decarbonization, etc., and also on reviewing the adaptation and resilience. What I would like to add is that since our friends from mainland China mentioned about the Greater Bay Area for Hong Kong, Guangdong, and Macau, it's a new initiative. It's not only about economy, not only about the fast express train and the bridge, but also about the other aspects. Within the government, again, we set up a high-level steering committee chaired by the chief executive this time, attended by the other ministers within the Hong Kong government, to consider what are the opportunities that we can optimize under the Greater Bay Area initiative. And I can tell you that within the number of the priorities, environment has been identified as one of the topmost priorities. So if you guys have any good ideas how, say, on air and other aspects, we can make the best use of the Greater Bay Area initiative, please share with us, so that we can not only make Hong Kong more climate ready and more environmentally friendly, but also the whole region better. Because it's not only about Hong Kong, but also the region and also more areas. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to my panel. I think you've given us a very quick summary of a very broad issue. Now we are going to have a break, and we'd like you to come back at 10:45. So you have time to talk to each other, and if you want to, you can buttonhole the speakers for a little bit more of their knowledge. So thank you again to the panel.